The sporting news is back for the 2022-23 NBA season, and with a new NBA season on the horizon, that means fantasy basketball is back. Gil McGregor here, joined by Kyle Irving. And Kyle, I know you pretty well. I feel like this is the time of the year where you thrive. Kyle, how are you feeling about fantasy basketball this year?
Well, it feels like fantasy football just started up, but before we know it, fantasy basketball season is just getting started. And I feel like that always catches people off guard because it comes so quickly after the start of fantasy football season. But, pretty quickly, you're going to have to shift your focus over to fantasy basketball if you're playing this year and get ready for the draft. And that's what we're here for today.
Exactly. Kyle got so much on the fantasy draft over at Sporting News and NBA Global, including who you should take in the draft. So when I was younger, Kyle, I was taught that there's no such thing as a dumb question, but there are questions with obvious answers. And that's where we'll start. If someone out there is lucky enough to win the first pick in their draft, I should ask, who should they take? I think it's an obvious answer, but since you give us that obvious answer, also explain to us why they should take this player number one.
Yeah, without a doubt, Nikola Jokic is the number one overall pick in fantasy drafts this year, regardless of head-to-head format or points. And the reason for that is more than just him being the back-to-back MVP. I think what it has to do with is his durability. This is a guy who plays seemingly, 70 games or more every single year for the Nuggets. He stays relatively healthy compared to anybody else that, you might consider with that number one overall pick. And this is a guy that averaged 27 points, 12 rebounds, 8 assists, and a steal a game last year. And he sneaks in some blocks. He knocks down threes. He shoots the ball with efficiency. He does everything that you're looking for in a number one overall pick in fantasy basketball. It's Nikola Jokic, hands down. I wouldn't even consider anybody else.
Yeah, Nikola Jokic, you talked about the stats. That's why he was the back-to-back MVP, or he is the back-to-back MVP, and we'll see if he can do it again for a third time. Don't think that's been done very much in NBA history, but he is certainly someone who can do it, and maybe he can lead your team to a fantasy championship this season. Now, the obvious answer is out of the way, but there are people who are going to be picking after the first pick, and that person who's picking first is going to have to wait a while if it's a snake draft. So for those who are maybe in that 2 to 5 range, I feel like it's a little bit more difficult to decide who it is that you want to take. There are a lot of stars in the NBA. So if you're picking in that 2 to 5 range, or even in the 6 to 10 range, in what order should you prioritize who you want to take in this year's fantasy draft?
Yeah, so after that number one overall pick, I'd like to break it down into tiers almost. And, you could move players up and down based on your preference. But to me, after Nikola Jokic, it feels like it's Giannis Antetokounmpo or Luka Doncic. And while, you could loop in players like Joel Embiid, Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, or Jason Tatum into that group, to me, it still feels like Giannis and Luka, because of what they contribute to all the stats across the board, they feel like they're in that second tier. And then when you get to that third tier, that's when you get into the guys like Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Jason Tatum, like I mentioned. And then after that, even a little bit further down, you get into guys like James Harden, Trae Young, who led the league in points and assists, total points and assists last year. Guys like LeBron James or LaMelo Ball, Jimmy Butler is another name that comes up in that group. I think I hit on just about everybody, maybe Karl Anthony Towns as well. Those are kind of that upper echelon of first round picks in fantasy basketball. But after that number one pick, if you have 2 to 3, I would consider a group of Luka Doncic and Giannis Antetokounmpo.
That makes a lot of sense. Luka and Giannis are two guys who will do a little bit of everything. They're going to get some double-doubles, some triple-doubles as well. And it's interesting that, I was waiting for you to say LeBron James' name, and it's interesting to me when you chose to tier him. So are you expecting a drop-off from him? He's turned 38 this season, or are you just thinking that those other guys just do more than him at this point in his career?
Here's the thing. When you look at other fantasy rankings, and as I did my fantasy rankings yesterday for the top 200, you're going to see LeBron James slide on a lot of people's rankings, but I'm just not ready to do that yet. This guy's coming off of a season where he averaged the second highest points per game in his entire career. He's not going anywhere. Even though it's year 20, I don't see him all of a sudden falling off a cliff. And he's someone that's going to produce in every single stat category across the board at a high level. I don't think you should shy away from LeBron James at all in fantasy drafts. If he's there, take him. Even if you feel like you're going to reach for him, still take him. The king is still the king. I don't see him falling off a cliff. No matter what you think about the Lakers, LeBron James is still a very valuable fantasy player this season, in my opinion.
And an interesting note on LeBron, he is on pace to pass Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in scoring and Magic Johnson in assists all time this year. So we'll have an incentive to produce this season. And the numbers will probably follow. The biggest thing is durability, which is also important in fantasy basketball. We'll see if he can make that happen. Shifting gears a little bit, we're talking about durability. The NBA wasn't the same last year. There were a lot of big names that did not play at all last season or missed a lot of time last season. I'm talking Kawhi Leonard, Zion Williamson, Jamal Murray, and there are plenty of other names, and I'm sure we're going to get into them. But when you're drafting, one, what type of caution should you have when taking somebody who missed a lot of time last year? And let me not forget Ben Simmons. And what are you expecting from those guys this season? We haven't seen them play basketball in over a year for a lot of these guys. So who are you prioritizing on the guys who are returning to action this season, and who should you go for?
The three guys that I'm prioritizing and I'm drafting without hesitation if they fall into my lap, that's Damian Lillard, it's Zion Williamson, it's Kawhi Leonard. You know, you've heard from all three of those guys that they feel like physically they are in a significantly better spot than they have been, you know, at any other point over the last two seasons. Damian Lillard was dealing with that abdominal injury since I think it was the 2019 Western Conference Finals, and he's been playing through that. Zion Williamson, we saw him at Media Day. He looks like he's in the best shape of his career. Kawhi Leonard looks like an edge rusher right now. I mean, these guys are all, they've just taken, you know, aside from Dame, who played a little bit in the beginning of the year, had taken the majority of the season or all of the season off last year, and they look ready to go now. And then there's other guys, you know, you mentioned Ben Simmons, Jamal Murray is another name. Those are guys that, you know, their ranking is going to slide a little bit just because it's been a while since they've stepped on the floor. But those guys are still going to produce at the same level that they did prior to the injury. Jamal Murray is still going to be one of the top scoring options in Denver. Ben Simmons is still going to be a do-it-all Swiss Army knife type guy for the Brooklyn Nets who can fill up stat categories across the way, especially if you're playing in a head-to-head league. So, you know, while I won't hesitate to take Zion or Dame or Kawhi Leonard, I would maybe show a little bit more hesitation. And I don't know if I would say hesitation. It would be patience would be the right word with guys like Ben Simmons and Jamal Murray, but I still wouldn't shy away from those guys either.
It's interesting you mentioned Ben Simmons, Jamal Murray. What stands out so much about them is the situations that they're in. As you mentioned, Denver, Brooklyn, two teams that are trying to contend for titles. And that's not to say that Portland and New Orleans are just going to slouch, and the Clippers are certainly trying to go for a title this year. But these guys might want to ease in a little bit because for their teams, it is definitely much more important that they're ready to contribute and produce in April, May, and hopefully for their sake, June, if they get that far. So I do understand the term patience is very important with guys like that. Talking about teams preparing to compete and wanting to win big, there are some teams this offseason that made some big swings. There are going to be some new faces in new places, and it's going to really kind of shape up and shake up the whole fantasy sphere. I'm thinking of three people specifically, two guys who were with the Jazz last year. Donovan Mitchell is now with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Rudy Gobert now in Minnesota. And then elsewhere, DeJounte Murray, who you had as a fantasy sleeper last year, and he definitely made you look good with the way he produced in San Antonio. He's now sharing a backcourt with Trae Young in Atlanta. And Trae Young is a guy who you mentioned should be one of your top picks in this draft. So when you talk about the player movement this offseason, how does that impact the guys who were moved, but also the guys who were already there in Minnesota, in Cleveland, and in Atlanta?
So DeJounte Murray was my crown jewel last year. And like you said, he made me pretty good. Unfortunately, I didn't get him in any of my leagues. So I didn't even take my own advice, and I wish I did. But with that being said, you know, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for him to produce at the same level this year, obviously, with how much Trae Young commands the ball. But he's still going to bring it with the defensive stats, which is huge, and that's a huge impact, to what he does in the fantasy sphere that makes him so valuable. But I still think, you know, he'll be someone that's producing points per game at probably 15 to 18. He's still going to make a run, with assists and, like I said, steals, rebounds. He's kind of a do-it-all type guy. So I wouldn't necessarily shy away from him. I just wouldn't draft him at the same value of where he finished last year, which, you know, in most head-to-head leagues was a top 10 player. And then, you know, when you talk about the other guys, you talk about Donovan Mitchell. He's someone who, again, he might not have the ball in his hands as a playmaker as much, but scoring is never going to come easier for Donovan Mitchell than it is this season because he's never been surrounded by this much talent on the offensive end. And Darius Garland is going to be incredible in setting him up and making life easy for him. So I do think that Donovan Mitchell gets a little bit of a boost because, you know, he might be able to save field goal percentage a little bit. He'll get some more open looks. He'll potentially even be scoring more. And then when you talk about Rudy Gobert, I think that's somebody that no matter which team he plays for, no matter what his role is, he's going to bring the same thing to the floor. You know, he's going to give you a nightly double-double threat. He's going to be someone that's going to average multiple blocks a game. He'll chip in steals as well. He's going to boost your field goal percentage. So I don't think his role changes all that much even though he'll be next to Karl Anthony Towns, I don't see his rebounding or anything like that taking a hit. So I would say, for someone like Rudy Gobert, you could probably draft him in a similar light that you would have if he was still in Utah.
Thinking about Rudy Gobert, thinking about the defensive front in Minnesota, and some of the guys on the team even admitted it already. They're not the strongest defensively, so his blocks might go up when guys are blowing by guys on the perimeter. We talked a little bit about injuries and guys coming back from injuries and new places and guys taking on new roles. Kind of a blend to blend those two ideas together. There are some big names around the NBA that aren't going to be available to start the season. Talking Chris Middleton in Milwaukee, talking Robert Williams in Boston, Jaren Jackson Jr., who was the NBA's blocks leader last season, not available in Memphis to start the season. So when you look at those players, are there anybody in Milwaukee or Memphis or Boston that you might look to snag to step up and replace their production? Or is it someone else deals where you draft those guys and stash them and wait for them to come back?
I think patience is a key word again for guys like that, because when you look at the case of like Robert Williams or Jaren Jackson Jr., those guys, they're both projected to be out until like roughly December, January, and who knows, they might ease them back into the rotation once they get back. But those are guys that can make a major impact for your fantasy team when it really matters in the fantasy season when playoffs come around. So you don't want to reach and you don't want to draft them at the same value that you would get them at if they were fully healthy. But I'm not, convinced that they're someone that you should completely shy away from either, because of how much they impact those defensive counting stats that are so valuable. But then, when you talk about a guy like Chris Middleton, he's another one who, points per game, assists per game, 3-pointers, like he's going to boost those categories at an efficient level for your team. And, again, I wouldn't draft him in the third or fourth round the same way that you would have if he's healthy. But he's, again, someone that you don't want to shy away from, because you know exactly what his role is in Milwaukee. And when he comes back and he gets into the swing of things, he's going to be that surefire number 2 option on the offensive end. And he can make a major impact for you down the stretch of the most important part of the fantasy season. So, I think when it comes to all 3 of those guys, you want to be a little bit more patient than usual. But also, when it gets to drafting those guys that maybe might just end up on your bench, or you could just take a flyer on one of those 3 players and throw them in your IR spot, I would kind of lean on doing the latter, just to have those guys on the roster for when it matters most.
And a quick programming note on those 3 guys. Chris Middleton, off-season surgery on his left wrist. Said he'll be back a little bit after opening night. Jaren Jackson Jr. had surgery on his foot. Should be back maybe at the end of the calendar year or the beginning of January. And Robert Williams played on that meniscus injury, or after a quick meniscus procedure in the playoffs, and then had another procedure on his knee to clean that up ahead of training camp. He'll be out 8 to 12 weeks per the Celtics. Now, I'd be remiss if we're talking new faces and new places and guys in new roles if I don't talk about the young fellas. Now, Kyle, the NBA draft, I feel like, is your other area of expertise, and this is a pretty special draft class. Unfortunately, we won't see Chet Holmgren this season. He'll be out all year with the Lisfranc injury, but there's some other talented guys this year. And I know the rookies will probably be later in the draft, because rookies don't necessarily produce like others. We were pretty lucky last year with what we saw with Scotty Barnes, Evan Mobley, and Cade Cunningham. But when you look at this year's draft class, are there any rookies that might be worth a late round pick or a mid round pick? What are you thinking about this rookie class?
I do think that right off the top, Paolo Banchero, number 1 overall pick, is another guy who contributes to every single category, and he'll give you a ton of assists from the forward position, which is uncanny. And I do think that he's someone that could make an immediate impact to the point that you draft him as, maybe even like a top 50 player this year, even though that's a little uncharacteristic for rookies. But then aside from him, other rookies that I would consider draftable, Keegan Murray for sure. He's my second-ranked rookie. Jabari Smith Jr. after him. And then you get into guards like Jaden Ivey and Benedict Mathurin. Those are, I would say that is the group of rookies that I would consider taking in the draft. And then after that, when you're looking at the waiver wire and you're starting to see what their role looks like on their team, other guys that I'm looking at, Tari Eason in Houston, just because he'll bring those defensive counting stats. Someone like Mark Williams in Charlotte. He's not going to be the starter on opening night, but if he plays well enough, I could see him working his way into a starter conversation as the year goes on. And then another player is Jalen Williams. Jalen Williams, Jalen Williams on the Oklahoma City Thunder. Have to clarify that because there's 2 of them. But with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander looking like he might miss the start of the season, he has that playmaking, scoring threat that OKC might try and input into their roster early on in the year. And if he excels in that role, they might continue to give him touches even when Shai Gilgeous-Alexander comes back. So the 5 guys off the top: Paulo, Keegan Murray, Jabari Smith Jr., Jaden Ivey, and Benedict Mathurin. Those are the guys that I would target in the draft. And then the rest of them, you can kind of just assess yourself on the waiver wire.
So you're talking about these rookies and the waiver wire and keeping an eye on it. It pretty much sounds like who can break out during the season. Now, rookies are a little bit different, but going into the season, I want to put you on the spot here and see if there's anybody, maybe circumstance, maybe it's some offseason workout videos you saw, maybe it's just your overwhelming belief. Who do you see as a breakout candidate in this upcoming season that's worth having on your fantasy team?
I like the term overwhelming belief because I felt that way about this guy heading into draft night 2 years ago, and I feel that way about him still right now. Tyrese Halliburton for the Indiana Pacers is going to be the DeJounte Murray breakout player of the year this year. It feels like he is in the perfect role in Indiana to, finally take over the keys of an offense the way that, we saw him produce at a very high level in fantasy last season with the Kings before he was traded to Indiana. And then he was even more valuable in the second half of the year after that trade. And when he gets a full season in that role, Tyrese Halliburton is going to be the player that is going to outperform his draft spot, I would say, over just about anybody else in the league this year. I couldn't be more confident in him. He's someone that I am certainly going to be reaching for. I would take him as early as the second round this year. That's how confident I am in how good he's going to be this year.
There you have it. I mean, Kyle, you are 1 for 1. We talked about your track record with DeJounte Murray last year. So for those of you out there listening, it'd be worth a second or third look at Tyrese Halliburton. You will not regret it. Now, let's keep putting you on the spot here. I'm going to ask you this time, who is the biggest sleeper this year? Who should we not sleep on in our fantasy drafts? Because I have one I'm preparing for too. So maybe I get some intel and not show this to anybody else and not tell anybody else in my league, and I'll maybe surprise some people.
So the player that is going to be my biggest sleeper, he might not be someone that everyone is all that familiar with, but I'm going to go with Alperen Şengün in Houston. He's someone who, he was a waiver wire gem at the end of the year last year for everybody that was playing fantasy down the home stretch of the playoffs once he really started to get those minutes. He's a super skilled big man who's going to contribute to points, rebounds. He can pass the ball. He can shoot it a little bit from the outside. He's going to give you the defensive counting stats as well. He's someone that now that he's stepping into a full-time starting center role, we already saw what he could do from a fantasy perspective in a small sample size. And now that he's going to be a starter full-time in Houston, I really like Alperen Şengün as someone who, when it gets to those later rounds, maybe it's the 7th, 8th, 9th round, and you're kind of looking at a rather blah, list of players that are still available. He's someone that I'd scroll a little bit further down in target because I think he's someone that's going to outperform his ADP this year for sure.
Alperen Şengün, a young Turkish big man coming off playing a little bit of overseas basketball this summer. And he doesn't talk to the basketball anymore during his free throws. So that's a little bit of a letdown, but he's going to get the numbers this year and that'll make up for all of that. Now, since we're on the topic of getting advice from the expert, Kyle, who should we stay away from or be wary of, be it for injury concerns or maybe just too much hype this upcoming season?
This is a player that, it almost feels predictable at this point, but someone that I will not be drafting is Anthony Davis. I already drafted Anthony Davis. I took him with a top 5 pick 2 years ago and he got hurt and it tanked my team. And I will not be making that same mistake, even though it seems like he's going to be back and healthy. And obviously he's going to be a major focal point in that Lakers rotation. He's someone that I just can't trust. Whether it's Darvin Ham talking about how he's going to try and manage him and LeBron's minutes early on in the year because they don't need to be playing playoff minutes in October and November, or, maybe he's taking off the second night of a back-to-back. Whatever the case may be, Anthony Davis, for as valuable as he is when he's healthy, and don't get me wrong, he's an absolute monster when he's healthy, and I could eat my words if he ends up playing 70 plus games this year. He could finish as a top 10 player in fantasy, but I'm not going to be the one that's willing to roll the dice and take that risk. And I don't think you should either.
Yeah, we will revisit this at the end of the year and take a tally of how many games Anthony Davis suits up for in the Lakers. And I'm sure Kyle is willing to admit if he's wrong. We'll see. I get a feeling, Kyle, you might be on to something. It's been a while since we've seen Anthony Davis play that many games. And in the age of load management, we might see the Lakers prioritize health and trying to return to the playoffs because they have real basketball to worry about. Fantasy basketball is above the Lakers' pay grade right now anyway. Hopefully this helps you out in getting prepared for your fantasy draft. And here is a reminder to subscribe to the Sporting News on YouTube. We have everything going beyond the box score in all sports, and that includes fantasy basketball. For Kyle Irving, I'm Gil McGregor. Thanks again for tuning in, and good luck in your draft.